Hi class, I wanted to go over this week's assignment for you really quickly, just so you understand what tools I'm looking for you to use, how we use those, and just kind of a nice base of painting textures in Mudbox. Anyway, let's look in Mudbox here. You can use any of these kind of default ones to play around with texture. Just to show you what I'm working with, I'm going to use the plane. You can, again, use whichever one you would enjoy. Painting and paint layers are a lot like your sculpting and sculpt layers. So how we have our sculpt tools over here, right next to it we have our paint tools. Same thing over here when we're used to our sculpt layers. Now we can go over one and see our paint layers. All right. A lot of these brushes and tools are very similar to tools that we've used before, whether it's in Photoshop, you know, any kind of painting tool. All right, so let's take a look at what some of these actually do. So we can start with our paintbrush here. Any of these brushes that you click on, you always want to check over here to see the options. You can change the strength, all that kind of stuff. Our paintbrush is very straightforward, and again you can hold B and then click and drag to change the size of your brush while you're working in it. But we've got our color here. If you double click, this color chooser is the exact same one that's in Maya, so if you're used to that, that's great. If not, it's not that complicated. You can pick whatever kind of color you want and then go into the square to have the pure version towards black, towards white. And you can just pick whatever. And then you can hit done, paintbrush. Actually, good point. If you click, it'll tell you to create a new layer. But let me show you how to make a new layer to start with. So over here, make sure you're in the painting side. It looks exactly the same as sculpt, except we don't have this level option. We can always add a new paint layer, which is just this page brush with the little plus icon. You can call this, you know, whatever you're dealing with. You could name it the texture. I'm going to call this brush just because I'm showing you the brush. Now these sizes, the 4000 is 4K. You want to make sure that you're having a high enough resolution. You know, we can always scale things down a little bit, but if you scale it up, you're going to get really pixelated and it won't work very well. With this, I'm just going to save as an 8-bit TIFF. You can save it as different formats, but for what we're doing today, an 8-bit TIFF will be fine. And then the channel is really important. Today we're dealing with just the diffuse, or you know, kind of the color and texture, but there are going to be times when we're going to create other ones, and they'll be separated in our layout over here. So I'm going to hit OK. Just like with sculpting, we can lock and unlock the layer, hide, and make visible. You can also right mouse click and see all of these options that we have to work with. A lot of times you might merge visible layers. You can solo selected, so if you have a ton of layers available and you just kind of want to see the one. You can solo as diffuse, which is kind of nice. So again, diffuse is our color and our kind of pattern texture layout, but we can take any layer, kind of our specular layer or you know, our normal map, and we can solo that as diffuse, and Mudbox will make that into kind of a colored layer so that it's easier for us to look at. You can still edit the strength here. This can go higher than 100, so feel free to type in numbers, or you can kind of click and lower it down, making it less visible. But for now, here we are. We've got our paintbrush, and let's paint. Woo! All right, so you can always just paint. If we end up holding down Shift while we paint, that's going to get us our blur brush, which you can also click on, but if we hold Shift and click and drag, we can blur. My blur is set pretty low. You can only see that it's kind of doing it. Let's look into the blur. Turn this up a little bit for the sake of things. Bring this up to a 5. I'll go back to my paintbrush. So again, holding Shift allows me to click and drag and use my blur brush. Also kind of explaining blur, again, blurs your main texture. If I want to hold Control and click and drag, what I get is the inverse color. Okay, so how do I know what the inverse color is? Well, if I look at my color wheel here, this is the color I've selected, so we're just going to go straight across, and that's what my inverse color is going to be. This works with textures and colors, so don't feel like you just have to use it with the paintbrush. Probably not the most commonly used tool, but available there for you to use. Projection, we'll take a look at in 1 second. Airbrush works very similar to the paintbrush, except you're doing more of a light paint. You can see that it's not even really showing up. I can turn up my strength a little bit more, but you're getting an airbrushed look, so it's just the different style, texture. With your paintbrush and the airbrush and the pencil, it's always great to kind of start at a lower strength and build on top of it. You know, if you really want to get kind of a feathered look, you can always click and drag to add more and more to it. Pencil, very similar to most software that we've used. It's a nice way to get a sharp line. Paint erase, your eraser. Clone works just like the clone stamp in Photoshop. So what you can do is Control and click on an area, and then if you let go and paint, you can see I'm painting what's in that exact area where I held Control and clicked. Now this gets a little difficult because if I move over, it's going to move over where my point was. So just make sure that if you're looking to, let's say I really want this loop of the green again, just click, hold Control, click and let go, and then you can paint that wherever you want. All right. Dodging and burning is another, they're kind of Photoshop tools. Dodge lightens and burn darkens. If you hold your mouse over any of these tools, they'll tell you what they do. You know, all of these pretty self-explanatory. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Again, we can use our stencils here or our stamps to fill in any of these as well. So one of the main things we have to do for this week's assignment is deal with the projection. Okay, so this is designed to work with a stencil. You can use an image that you've taken, you can use something that you've created, or any of the basics here. Let's use this grass texture. So this is showing how big our stencil is. There's nothing actually on my piece yet, but if I click and drag, I'm actually painting that stencil onto my object. All right, now you can, and it says it down here, but you can hide the stencil by hitting Q. So if you just wanted to paint, or you could bring it back. If you hold S on your keyboard and use your left mouse button, you can rotate the stencil for painting. If you use the right mouse button, you can scale the stencil. So let's say I want a small one. Sorry, my dog just knocked something off the table. Or you can hold S and middle mouse button to move the location of where the stencil is. Okay, now this is a projection. I like to think of this as, I mean, same word, but like a projector in a classroom. So what we're doing here is we're taking 3D objects that we've created and we're applying a 2D texture onto it. So think about a sheet of paper and like a basketball. You know, we're having to take this two-dimensional flat texture and wrap it around a basketball. And that's why it's so important that we understand unwrapping in Maya or Max, but in Mudbox we can do the same thing. So we're using our projector of a 2D image and just projecting it onto our 3D plane, and then with this projection brush we're allowed to paint that onto it. All right, So, you know, again, we can just have fun painting. Any of these brushes that you're using, make sure to check over here again so you can check size, strength, and color. But you can really have fun with this assignment and creating some cool textures onto your object. Alright, so this last brush we need to look at is this dry brush. Now this comes into play when you've got your mesh already molded with detail. So we need some like mountains and some valleys for this to work. So let's just really quickly, we'll go to my sculpt tools. I'll make sure my stencil's turned off. I'll go into my sculpt, and then I'll just simply, we'll do a little mountain, we'll do a little valley, just so you guys can get kind of the points here. All right, so what I'm dealing with is this. You know, you can smooth a little bit, but so if we go back to our paint tools and this dry brush, let's pick a color. We'll go green. Now what this dry brush does is it allows you to paint over it, but it's only going to paint green the highest levels of your mesh. Now you can adjust this with your strength, but then if I hold Control, let's change my color first, do blue. Control is going to allow you to paint on the bottom levels. I know I talked before that Control was the inverse, but when you're in this dry brush, it's just inverting what your dry brush is painting. Okay, so again, with the dry brush, we'll grab a green. Actually, we'll do the same one. If you just paint, it'll allow you to paint the topmost levels, and if you hold Control, you have to change color first or else it doesn't work. If you hold Control and paint, it'll start to paint that bottom. All right, so we want to use the projection. Take a look at all these other painting tools, really add some details. You can use stencils. You can do multiple layers, so feel free. You're going to just be in the diffuse channel, but you can do several layers on top of each other. So if my last one was brush, maybe I want to focus in on the projection and create a projection layer, and again you can toggle on and off the eyeball. So you know, after playing around with it, I want you to definitely show me that you understand the tools, but then maybe you can come up with the one that you think works best.